Hi there, and thanks for joining me again here at SoundOptic.com's Basic Pro Tools tutorials. If you're just tuning in, I apologize, but I just realized that on my last tutorial, I actually neglected the sixth tool up here in the toolbar, so I just wanted to briefly talk about that before we get started on today's topic. If you'll bear with me. If you switch to the pencil tool here, you'll see that at this particular magnification level, it is not available. It is grayed out here. It will not allow me to do anything. But as we zoom in, you may notice that it will eventually come online there. And the purpose of this tool is, as you might expect, you can draw with it, and particularly draw in a waveform. I found this pretty interesting tool. I've used it actually in the past for if there was an anomaly like a tick or a pop in a soundtrack here. Maybe you'll be able to hear it if I scrub over. If that had already existed, of course, if I hadn't just created it, you could conceivably go in and draw a line, a zero line at this point, and then hear nothing, obviously. In this case, it's silence anyway. But you can redraw a waveform basically to accommodate, or rather to fix a problem, or I suppose if you were incredibly skilled at it, you could make an entire song out of it. Maybe not. But at any rate, I didn't want to skip over that tool. Like I've said, I never found it particularly useful, but you very well may. So there it is. All right. Well, for today's tutorial, I wanted to touch on the basics a little deeper with our hardware setup and the I/O setup, the input-output routing of based on that hardware setup, and then of course how it applies to the actual track I/O, the physical inputs and outputs on the tracks that you create. And if that seems confusing at the moment, hopefully by the end of this tutorial it'll be somewhat straightened out. But let's just for fun, let's create a new session. And I'm actually going to have a little audio playing here in the background. At some point I have the movie Avatar running on a DVD player into my inputs 1 and 2 here. So you guys will be able to hear what I'm talking about, or at least hear an example of some sound coming through an input. But let's switch to, or make sure we stay on Pro Tools. We'll do Apple N for a new session. We'll create from a new session, and I'll stay with the old standby here, 24-bit 48K broadcast wave, and I'll stick with my general 5.1 plus 2 routing. I'll call this session Avatar. And notice that defaulting to the last place, I have a folder on my storage drive called tests at this point with 3 or 4 very generic ones, but I'll call this one Avatar and hit save. Now, as we've talked about in the last lesson, if I make any recordings at this point or import any audio, all the audio that I'm recording will be put to the root folder here where I just saved this session. So we'll see if I remember to show you an example at the end here or not. But anyway, let's get to the first part, which is hardware setup. And this page will look different, obviously, based on whatever Pro Tools system you're using. In my case, I've got an HD with a 192 and a couple 882s attached to it. In fact, let me show you, before we go down that road, I'll show you a visual representation here of the hardware that I have. So you see it. I have a single 192 I/O showing up and 2 88220s that are legacy peripherals that I'm actually not using. They're not assigned to anything at the moment, but they are part of the hardware setup. They aren't self-recognized for what it's worth, but they do exist in my setup. If I want to incorporate them, I can do so by adding an I/O setup here for them. But at any rate, let's look first at the hardware setup. And the main page of the hardware setup, there's actually some redundant information. All this is basically telling you is that there are physical inputs on the back of this 888, excuse me, I'm speaking in old peripherals, of this 192, and they consist of a 16-channel input section and a 16-channel output section, and it pairs them up in stereo here. And you'll see that I've got it basically 1-to-1. I have one analog card with 8 inputs and one digital card with 8 inputs, and one selectable, well, you can actually select more than one, but the same in output routing. So if we look at this generically, you'll see that 1 and 2 route to analog 1 and 2, very basic understanding. 3 and 4 to 3 and 4, and so on. 9 and 10, now the physical inputs that are 9 and 10 on the back are the part of the digital card, which I have set to AES EBU 1 and 2. If you were using the optical inputs, you could switch this to ADAT optical 1 and 2, and so on, or any combination therein. You could have 9 and 10 be AES, 11 and 12 be optical. You can mix and match anything you want here. That's available anyway. You'll see that my default digital format is AES EBU, but it could be SPDIF, Sony Philips digital interface format, or optical SPDIF, which is the same standard put across an optical cable. Evidently, there was a difference between Tascam and everybody else when it came to SPDIF format. Never run into a necessity to have that checked at this point. And there's a port on the back either for an expansion I/O, which means that I could daisy chain another 192 here off of my first. You can daisy chain up to 2 of them, I believe 32 channels, 32 I/O per DigiLink cable, which also corresponds to being connected to my HD core card. You could have up to 6 192s basically on an HD3 Excel. But in my case, I don't have any more 192s or 96 IOs or any of that nature. I have a legacy device, as they like to call it, attached to it, the legacy ports with a Y cable, actually, just like the old 888s did in the original TDM systems. And in order to take advantage of those, I have to actually click Legacy IO. I'm not selecting anything new, whatever. And we'll see, sorry, the next tab in here is the analog inputs. This is actually just talking about whether I'm using the +4 input or the -10. There are 2 DB25 connectors on the back of the 192. One is for the +4, the pro line level inputs, and one is for -10, which is considered a more consumer line input. So your regular RCA connected, for instance, DVD player, which is why these are all selected, because I have a consumer DVD plugged in. And there's actually 2 input trim pots on the back, which could be selected. You could use either one. So if you had 2 different calibration levels, you could switch back and forth between them here. You could designate which trim pot you want to have be the calibration pot for the analog input. It's kind of a nice feature, actually. And if you're familiar with Apogee 88,000s, for instance, the old 88,000s, or any of the Rosettas actually have a soft limit function. DigiDesign incorporated that idea into the 192, so it's only for the analog input. You can select single channels to have a soft limiter built in, which is actually very nice if you're doing something with lots of transients like drum tracking or something. Could definitely keep you from clipping, and it actually makes a nice, kind of a nice sound when it's limiting, doing its job. Analog outputs, same designation, 2 different output trims for 2 different output pots. And the digital page says that my input format for 1 through 8 will be any of these 3. And sample rate convert, I've never actually used, but I'm taking a guess that you can actually hook up a device like a CD player that spits out 44.1 digitally into, well, I don't know which, but into an ADAT maybe, or TDIF, or even an old ADAT that's running at 44.116. And presumably if you check these, it will do a sample rate convert on the fly if your Pro Tools session itself is in a different sample rate or different bit rate perhaps, but at any rate, at a different sample rate. So that in a nutshell is the hardware setup page. Now if we look at the I/O setup, this is where it gets very interesting. You can set this up to your absolute liking, and you can save any of the settings that you make here as a whole by exporting it, or obviously you can bring an old one in by importing. But you'll see that a little bit of this information is redundant from the other page, and that you can select the 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and so on of the analog inputs. You can switch them to be anything you like. Same with the optical. There's actually one more port on the back that's an XLR style stereo, or I should just say 2-channel AES EBU input that they call the enclosure, the ENCL. So that's handy if you are printing back to a DAT or something. You can actually say, oh, okay, I want this one to be the enclosure I/O or whatever. But it is useful for 2-channel I/O. And you'll see my settings actually pretty straightforward here. I've got 8 stereo input tracks, and they have, this is the primary path, and they have subpaths, which are, as you can see, is stereo, and then 2 monos, left, right, mono, mono. In my case, I actually have a DVD player hooked up to this 1 and 2 so we'll get to that in a minute actually, but just wanted you to see that there's a direct relationship between, this is what you're going to see show up on your tracks in Pro Tools. Your physical tracks here will have the ability to be input routed to exactly what you see here. The outputs I've actually created for this particular I/O setup, a 5-1 out with a bunch of subpaths, and a 7 and 8, which is just another stereo out corresponding to the output path of 7 and 8 here. Fairly straightforward. I won't get into inserts at the moment, but I guess I do. I have my 882 set up to be hardware inserts. I'll get into what that means specifically later, but just know that they exist here in this page. And of course, buses. I think the HD system can have up to 128 buses. I could be wrong about that, but you can basically create buses just like an analog console would have, or a digital console for that matter, to internally route signals from within a session from one path to another. So let's see this in practical usage. I'm going to create a new stereo audio track here. And if I flip to the mix window, you'll see that it defaulted to the first I/O input, which is analog 1 and 2. And its output is stereo, which is actually a subpath within my 5.1 output setting. But I'm going to change that to 7 and 8 because that's my 7 and 8 outputs are what's feeding the console, so you can be able to hear what's going on. You can hear that I'm now in input, obviously. There's a DVD playing in the background. Turn down just a little bit there. But that's coming into my analog input 1 and 2. So, for instance, if this was always the way I wanted it to be, if my studio was hardwired this way, I could go to the I/O setup page, and just for recognition's sake, I could say, oh, well, analog 1 and 2 has my DVD player attached to it, so I'm just going to name this DVD in. And you'll see that once I hit OK on this page, now my input says DVD in. So you can see that there's a direct correlation between the I/O setup here, which of course shows your physical setup, what's patched in to the 192 here, and your actual I/O routing here on a track. If I had a 5.1 track, you would also see that I have no input at the moment because I didn't create a 5.1 I/O path. But you'll see that it just say 5.1 for the output. And inputs are specific. You always have to have your input, the number of inputs match the number of audio track channels, I should say, within the track. So if you create a stereo track, you have to designate a stereo input. That isn't true of the outputs, however. The outputs can be summed. For instance, if I wanted all of this to go out output 7, we'll hear it show up in one ear because that just happens to be how I have it routed on my Mackie console for my monitoring purposes here, but we'll leave it at 7 and 8 for obvious reasons. And now you have a little bit of understanding about how I/O setup works and how it correlates to your track routing. And we should be ready to move on to bigger and better sessions. So I thank you for tuning into this second edition of SoundOptic.com's Basic Pro Tools tutorials. And in our next tutorial, we'll talk a little bit more about recording audio to tracks and some more advanced features of editing and whatnot. We'll just go from there. So I appreciate you tuning in, and please check back periodically to see more tutorials. Thanks very much.